It sits on a bed of crushed ice under bright white light. A fillet of Atlantic salmon. The color is somewhere between sunset and coral, rich pink shading into orange near the belly, fading slightly toward the tail. The surface has that wet sheen that makes you think fresh, that makes you think ocean, that makes you think wild. The label says fresh Atlantic salmon. The price is $14 a pound, and the color is a lie. Not an exaggeration, not a stretch, a lie. That fillet, before a chemical intervention, was gray. Not pale pink, not cream, gray, like a chicken breast. Gray, like tofu. The animal that produced that meat never ate a single thing in its life that would have turned its flesh pink. The color you see was chosen from a catalog, like picking paint at a hardware store. The catalog has a name. It is called Samophan. Remember that name. Samophan is a physical card made of 15 color strips, numbered 20 through 34. Strip 20 is almost white. Strip 34 is deep red-orange. A salmon farmer flips through the strips, picks a number, and says, "That is the color I want my fish to be." Then the feed company adjusts the dosage of synthetic pigment in the food pellets until the flesh matches the swatch. The farmer does not hope for a color. He orders it. The pigment is called astaxanthin. The synthetic version is manufactured from petrochemicals, specifically from isophorone, a chemical derived from acetone, run through a multi-step process called the Wittig reaction. The end product is a powder. It gets mixed into feed pellets at precise concentrations. Over the final months before slaughter, the pigment accumulates in the muscle tissue. The fish turns pink, not because it ate krill, not because it swam 1,000 miles through cold Pacific water, because a factory in the Netherlands calculated the exact milligrams per kilogram of feed needed to hit number 27 on a color card, and you paid extra for it. Here is how the scam works at the register. Different numbers on the Salmophan produce different prices at the market. A fillet scoring 22 to 24 is considered poor color by the industry. It sells at a discount. A fillet scoring 33 to 34 is premium, maximum price. The difference is not nutrition. The difference is not freshness or taste or origin. The difference is how much dye the fish ate before it was killed. In 2006, a researcher named Frode Alfnes at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences published a study in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. He and co-author Atle Guttormsen tested a simple question. Would consumers pay more for redder salmon? They would, significantly more. Then he told them the redness came from synthetic colorants in the feed. He showed them the mechanism, he explained the chemistry, and he tested them again. They still paid more. The preference did not decrease. Knowing the color was artificial changed nothing. The association between pink and quality was already so deep in consumer psychology that facts could not reach it. And they knew. The company that makes the pigment knew this better than anyone because they commissioned the market research. DSM, a Dutch chemical conglomerate, later renamed DSM Firmenich after a 2023 merger, put it in their own marketing materials. Their words. According to sophisticated market research, darker colored salmon commands a higher price. That is the company that makes the dye, quoting its own research, confirming that color drives price. DSM does not merely sell the synthetic astaxanthin, they also created the Salmophan. They sell the color card that defines what the correct shade of salmon should be, and they sell the pigment that achieves it. One company decided what color your salmon should be, sells the chemical to make it that color, and sells the tool to verify it reached the right shade. And in 2023, they released the Digital Samophan, a mobile app that photographs a fillet and automatically assigns a number on the scale. More precision, more control, more profit at every link in the chain. That is the mechanism. Now here is how it was built. In the 1960s, two brothers named Grantvedt in Norway began the first experiments raising Atlantic salmon in ocean pens. By 1971, they harvested the first commercial crop. The industry grew at 40% per year through the mid-1970s. The fish was rare. The price was 10 times what it is today. Nobody noticed the color. because in those early years, the volumes were so small that consumers did not have strong expectations. But as production scaled through the late 1970s, something happened. Farm salmon started showing up next to wild salmon at the fish counter, and it looked wrong. Wild sockeye, wild king, wild coho all had that deep pink to red flesh that consumers associated with quality and freshness. The farmed fish was pale, grayish, unappetizing. In the wild, the color comes from the food chain. Microalgae produce astaxanthin as a protective pigment against UV radiation. Zooplankton, krill, copepods eat the algae. They accumulate the pigment. Salmon eat the krill. Over years of migration and feeding, thousands of miles of open ocean, the astaxanthin builds up in the muscle and fat. Farmed salmon eat none of that. Their feed is a pellet made from fish meal, soy, canola, corn, and vitamins. No krill, no zooplankton, no algae, no astaxanthin. Without it, the flesh is gray. Consumers would not buy it. This was a crisis for an industry growing at extraordinary speed. By 1989, Norway alone was producing 118,000 metric tons of farmed salmon, roughly 70% of the entire world supply. You cannot sell 118,000 tons of gray fish. You need it to look like wild fish. In the early 1980s, a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Hoffmann-La Roche, based in Basel, developed the first synthetic astaxanthin. They branded it Carophil Pink. By 1985, it was in commercial use in salmon feed across Norway. The problem was solved overnight. Feed companies bought the pigment, mixed it into pellets, and the fish turned pink. Consumers could not tell the difference. The industry had found its solution, an invisible additive that made a factory-farmed product look like a wild one. But the solution needed standardization. Different farms were getting different results. Some fish came out too pale, some too orange, some unevenly colored. The industry needed a way to measure and control the shade with precision. That is why, around 1998, DSM and Roche developed the Salmon fan. 15 numbered color strips, a universal language for salmon flesh color. Every farm, every feed company, every buyer could negotiate in numbers instead of adjectives. Instead of saying, "I want pinker fish," a buyer could say, "I want a 26." Different markets had different targets. In Europe, the preferred range was 22 to 27, a moderate pink. In Japan, 30 to 34, an intense red. The Salmon fan standardized the deception across borders. In 2002, Hoffmann-La Roche sold its entire astaxanthin business to DSM. The Dutch company took over Carophil Pink and launched an improved formula called Carophil Stay Pink. DSM became the dominant supplier of synthetic astaxanthin to the global aquaculture industry. By then, the Norwegian parliament had already passed its first law regulating salmon farms back in 1973. In 1978, they imposed a moratorium on new farms because growth was too fast. But at no point did anyone legislate the color. Nobody required disclosure. Nobody asked why farmed fish was suddenly the same shade as wild fish when it had no biological reason to be. That was 2002. It is still happening right now. Today, over 95% of all astaxanthin used in aquaculture is synthetic, made from petrochemicals. The global market for astaxanthin hit $1.96 billion in 2025, and roughly 45% of that goes to the aquaculture and animal feed segment. Nearly $1 billion just for the dye. The pigment alone accounts for 15 to 20% of the total production cost of farmed salmon. Think about that. Not the fish itself, not the feed grain, not the nets, the boats, the labor, the refrigeration. The single largest variable cost category besides feed is the chemical that makes the meat look like a different product. $1,000 per kilogram for synthetic astaxanthin. That is the production cost. Natural astaxanthin, extracted from the microalgae Haematococcus pluvialis, costs $7,000 per kilogram, 7 times the price. The economics are obvious. Nobody is switching. The industry's own supplier, Algatech, a competitor that makes natural astaxanthin, has admitted it publicly. Their words: essentially all astaxanthin used in aquaculture is a petrochemical product. And here's where it gets worse. The synthetic astaxanthin in your salmon is chemically different from the natural version. Natural astaxanthin, the kind wild salmon accumulate from eating krill, is predominantly one specific molecular shape, the 3S, 3' S stereoisomer. Synthetic astaxanthin is a racemic mixture, a jumble of 3 different shapes, only 25% of which matches the natural form. The natural version is 20 to 30 times more bioavailable as an antioxidant in the human body. This matters because one of the reasons you eat salmon is for its antioxidant properties. The marketing says salmon is good for you partly because of astaxanthin. But the astaxanthin in farm salmon is the cheap synthetic version. Your body can barely absorb it. You are paying a premium for a health benefit that the industrial version mostly does not deliver. You know what happened next in the timeline? In 2003, the Environmental Working Group published the first large-scale testing of farm salmon. The results were devastating. Farm salmon contained 5.2 times more PCBs than wild, 40 times more PCBs than milk, 4 times the PCB levels of beef. The same year, a study published in Science by Rosamund Naylor at Stanford documented the broader ecological destruction. In 2004, follow-up research in Science by Naylor and colleagues found that farm salmon from Scotland and the Faroe Islands was the most contaminated. The industry's response was not to fix the contamination, it was to protect the brand. Marine Harvest, the world's largest salmon farming company, founded by Thor Mowinckel, rebranded itself in 2019. New name, Mowi. The rebrand was aimed at connecting with millennials. 2 years earlier, in Chile, 690,000 of their salmon had escaped from a single broken pen into wild rivers. Genetic contamination of wild populations. You know what he did after that? In 2021, Mowi settled a class action lawsuit for $1.3 million. Their duck trap brand of smoked salmon had been marketed as being from Maine. The fish was actually raised in Chile, Scotland, Iceland, and Norway. A $1.3 million settlement for lying about where a fish comes from. And they knew. That same year, 2 artists named Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alon Schwab, working under the name Cooking Sections, exhibited a piece called Salmon, a Red Herring, at Tate Britain in London. The Salmofan was the centerpiece. They displayed the color card as what it is, a tool for coloring animals. The Tate removed farmed salmon from the menus at all 4 of its locations, but the industry did not flinch. In 2023, DSM Firmenich launched the digital Salmofan app. That same year, Scottish salmon farms reported a record 17.4 million dead fish, an increase of 193% compared to 2020. An independent audit found the Scottish industry had underreported antibiotic use by 66%. The California Supreme Court ruled in 2008 that federal food law does not block states from suing grocery stores that sell farmed salmon without marking it as color added. The case was called Farm-Raised Salmon Cases. The court's own language described the situation plainly. Fish farmers feed farm-raised salmon the chemicals astaxanthin and canthaxanthin to obtain a color of flesh resembling that of wild salmon. Without the color additives, the flesh typically appears grayish. That is from a state Supreme Court ruling, official legal language, describing your salmon as grayish. That was 2008. It is still happening right now. So what did the law actually change? Almost nothing. This is the part where most people assume the system protects them. It does not. In the United States, the FDA requires that if synthetic color is added to salmon, the label must say color added or artificial color added. That is the rule. It exists. It is on the books. The maximum allowable concentration is 80 milligrams per kilogram of finished feed, but the rule only applies to retail, grocery stores, fish markets. Restaurants have no obligation to tell you anything. Your $15 salmon entree could be gray fish dyed to shade 27, and the menu will never mention it. No disclosure required. The Oceana study from 2015 tested salmon across the country. 43% of samples were mislabeled. Of the fraudulent samples, 69% were farm salmon sold as wild. In restaurants, the mislabeling rate was 67%. 2 out of every 3 pieces of salmon tested in restaurants were not what the menu said they were. In supermarkets, the rate was 20%, lower, but still 1 in 5. Now multiply that across the entire supply chain. Salmon passes through multiple intermediaries between the farm and your plate. Labels get lost. Country of origin gets confused. What starts as farmed Atlantic salmon from Chile arrives at a restaurant in New York described simply as salmon. Nobody verifies. The price difference between farmed and wild salmon is $3 to $5 per pound. Selling farmed as wild is pure profit, and the risk of getting caught is negligible. Oceana found that the fraud was seasonal. It spiked in winter, when wild Alaskan salmon is out of season. When real supply drops, fake supply fills the gap. Nobody notices because the color looks right, because the dye is doing its job. The EU has its own version of this failure. Canthaxanthin, a cheaper pigment the industry used alongside astaxanthin for decades, was pulled from the EU market for salmon feed, but not because regulators determined it was dangerous, because the manufacturers did not bother submitting the paperwork for reassessment under new regulations. They let the approval lapse. Astaxanthin remains fully legal across Europe, with a limit of 25 milligrams per kilogram of feed, and across both continents, a fundamental loophole persists. The word natural on an astaxanthin label can apply to pigment made by yeast fermentation or bacterial synthesis. The consumer reads natural and thinks wild. The producer means manufactured by an organism in a lab instead of synthesized from petroleum. The distinction is meaningless to the person buying the fish, and that's just one company. This extends beyond DSM. Approximately 25 companies control 80% of global farmed salmon production. Norway produces 52% of the world total, 1.479 million metric tons in 2023. Chile produces 29%, another 1.1 million tons. The total global production of farmed Atlantic salmon reached 2.8 million metric tons in 2023. Every single one of those fish ate synthetic astaxanthin. Every one was colored from a formula. Every one was checked against a scale derived from the Salmon. The feed companies that mix the pigment into pellets, Skretting, Biomar, Cargill Aqua Nutrition, they all buy Carofill from DSM Firmenich. They mix it into microgranules at concentrations calibrated to hit whatever number the buyer ordered on the Salmon scale. The whole supply chain knows. The farmer knows, the feed company knows, the processor knows, the distributor knows, the retailer knows. The only person who does not know is you. Alaska saw this coming. In 1990, their state legislature passed a law, Statute 16.40.210, banning all finfish farming in Alaskan waters. The commercial fishing industry lobbied for it. They wanted to protect the premium brand of wild Alaskan salmon. They understood that if cheap farmed fish flooded the market with fake color, their product's reputation would collapse. They were right. In February 2025, Alaska's Governor Mike Dunleavy introduced a bill to partially lift the 35-year ban. The legislature rejected it. Alaska remains the only major jurisdiction in the world that intentionally prohibits salmon farming. 1 state out of 50. 1 jurisdiction in a global industry. Everywhere else, the system works exactly as designed. A farmer picks a color from a catalog. A feed company mixes the right dose of synthetic pigment from petrochemicals into pellets. The fish eats the pellets for months. The flesh turns pink. The fish is slaughtered. The fillet is placed on ice under bright lights. The label says fresh Atlantic salmon. The price reflects the color. And you, standing at the fish counter, choosing between 2 fillets, reach for the one that is pinker. Because your brain says pink means wild. Pink means healthy. Pink means real. It does not. The entire system is circular. DSM creates the color standard. DSM sells the pigment to meet that standard. DSM sells the measurement tool to verify the standard was met. The consumer pays more for darker fish. The farmer buys more pigment. DSM profits on every revolution of the wheel. The laws that should stop this do not work. The FDA rule exists but applies only to retail and enforcement is weak. Restaurants are exempt. Mislabeling runs at 43% nationally. The courts confirmed in 2008 that the salmon is gray without additives. Almost 2 decades later, most consumers have never heard of Samofan. Tomorrow you will walk past a fish counter. There will be salmon on ice. It will be pink. The label will not tell you why.